Today we're going to talk about ecology a little bit, specifically how communities and ecosystems work when we're talking about ecology. So ecologists use a hierarchical system to talk about how life is organized within ecology. So just like when we think about in biology, right, we use taxonomic trees to talk about different species and how they're related to each other. Ecologists use a similar system to talk about how organisms or animals and plants are organized and related to each other. So the highest rank or the biggest portion of this hierarchical system is the biosphere, right? So we're in the section of the semester where we're talking about the biosphere, right? So the biosphere we know is one of Earth's 4 spheres, and it's just that total area on Earth where living things are found, right? Which basically encompasses the geosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. And then if you kind of zoom into a specific portion of the biosphere that has a distinct climate and particular composition of plants and animals that are adapted to that climate, we call that a biome. And so maybe you've heard of biomes before. When we sort of broke down those different climate realms, think about maybe a desert biome would be an example of a biome, right? Where you have specific plants and animals that are adapted to live in a desert biome. If we zoom in a little closer on a specific portion of a biome, we can break that down into an ecosystem. And remember that an ecosystem is both the living or biotic and non-living or abiotic components that are interacting with each other, right? So when we're thinking about ecology, yes, we're thinking about biological organisms, but specifically we're thinking about how those biological organisms interact with their environment or the non-living components that surround them. If we're talking about communities within an ecosystem, that would be all of the populations, so all of the plants, animals, and other things that are living and interacting within a certain area. So you can think about a community as being the living portion of the ecosystem, right? You can think of the community as being the biotic component of the ecosystem. And then if we use that word population, that's just a group of individuals of the same species, right? So we might talk about the human population, or we might talk about the cat population on campus, right? Because we have a certain group of individuals in the population of campus. We also have other species, right? We also have these weird squirrels, right? We can talk about the squirrel population on campus. We can talk about those feral cats, right? The population on campus. And then an individual obviously is just a single member of the population, like you would be an individual of the population on campus. So within ecology, each species in a particular habitat has a specific niche within its community. And what a niche is basically that each species has plays a really special role. It has its own little place where it can meet all of its energy and nutrient requirements. And even though it's interacting with other species within the ecosystem, each species has one sort of sole little niche, one sole little place where they've kind of chiseled out that they're specialized to fit in. So I know that we did that reading week before last about ecology, but here's another similar definition to what an ecosystem is, which we can call a community of living organisms and the non-living components of the environment. And those living or biotic and non-living or abiotic components interact together as a system, right, which we call an ecosystem. These components are interacting through energy flowing between them, as in our trophic levels, our food webs that we talked about in class, last time we met in person. And they're also linked together through nutrient cycles, right? They're linked together through carbon and other nutrients that are moving through the food web. So the weird thing about ecosystems is they can really be any size, and we just define them by the characteristics of their environment. So for example, we can talk about maybe the ecosystem of Western Ohio. Maybe we could talk about the ecosystem of sort of the Midwest as a whole, right? Because the ecosystem of the Midwest as a whole is pretty similar. And so we can also talk about maybe our digestive systems as being an ecosystem, right? Because we have microbes that are inhabiting our digestive systems, and they are sort of interacting with their both biotic and abiotic environment within our digestive systems. So you can take a second and think about, maybe you can think of some other examples of what an ecosystem might be. All right, so the important thing to know about ecosystems is that resources are limited within ecosystems, right? So we don't just have unlimited resources. There's going to be at least one resource at any given time that is limiting the population size, right? Because if we had unlimited resources, there would never be a cap to our growth, right? We would just continue to grow exponentially. All the animals would continue to grow exponentially. And then very soon, population would be out of control on Earth. And so we kind of have these limited resources that are controlling ecosystems. And so since resources are limited, the species within an ecosystem are actively competing for resources. And we call that interspecific competition. So interspecific competition is specifically when two or more species, right, two or more different species are competing for the same resource. So for example, in a forest, one species of tree and one species of shrub, maybe they're competing for light and nutrient resources in that forest environment. Usually the trees win because they can outgrow the shrubs, right? They can grow above the shrubs and get more light and nutrients that way. So since species are competing with each other for these limited resources, this is where this idea of a niche really comes into play, where if you're a species and you fulfill some specific niche, right, you have some special skill that will allow you to coexist with another species that maybe has another niche, right? So even though we kind of like look at wildflowers and they all seem kind of similar below ground, they actually have really different niches. Notice some have really fine roots that spread out wide, some have sort of thicker roots that spread down low. And so that's how plants are able to coexist despite competing for those limited resources, right? Because they kind of have these little specializations that help them compete, right, with each other, but not maybe directly. They can kind of spread out, right? This guy can get resources from way down here and sort of survive when this one here is more specialized to get lots of nutrients up here, right? They just have different specializations. All right, so interspecific competition is when different species are fighting for the same limited resource, and then essentially the species that uses that resource most effectively is able to prosper at the expense of others, right? So we see this all the time in the natural world where we have different species competing with each other and one sort of comes out on top. And this is what we did a lot of interspecific competition in the lab last week with that model that we were running, right? Where we would have like 3 herbivores and we were seeing how they competed with each other, right? And notice that one usually came out doing better than the other species that it was competing against. And so Interspecific competition is competition between different species. Intraspecific competition is competition among individuals within the same species, right? So if you were competing against another human for those resources, that would be intraspecific competition. And I always used to have a hard time with inter versus intra. And so I always think the interstate is the road that goes between states. And so inter means between different things. Intra, right, like introspection, when you look inside yourself, right, would be within the same group. And so there's all kinds of types of interactions among species for sort of this competition, interspecific competition relationship. Obviously, predation is one of the main types of competition in the ecological world, right? Where predators are consuming their prey, they are actively feeding on other organisms to live. And so, right, we sort of see this arms race of predators getting bigger teeth and faster, being able to run faster and being able to stalk and hide, and sort of on the other side, the prey getting also developing these skills to kind of avoid predation, right? So we kind of have seen with this predator-prey relationship competition kind of evolution along with that. So specifically, right, predators can have a really specific influence on the composition of the community. So if you remove a predator from an ecological community, particularly one that's kind of a top predator, it can have a significant change on the ecosystem. So for example, in Yellowstone, when the wolves were removed, basically there weren't wolves to prey on the elk. The elks overate on all of the trees. And essentially, right, we had way too many elk and not enough food for the elks to eat because that sort of top predator, the wolf, when it was removed, had a significant change on the composition of the community. One of these sort of evolutionary relationships with predator-prey relationships is the development of camouflage. So camouflage is one of the adaptations that allows individuals to survive in this kind of predator-prey world, right? You know, sometimes the best competitors are those that are good at hiding, right? If you are this pygmy seahorse that's really good at hiding, and then maybe there's another species of seahorse that's not as great at hiding, right? The predator's gonna eat the one that's easier to see. Right, so camouflage is not a random thing that happens. It's actually has been evolved through this predator-prey relationship over time. Sort of the next concept when we're thinking about ecology are R and K selected species. And so these are kind of two different basically reproductive styles that we talk about in ecology, right? So there's kind of two main ways that you can reproduce as a species. And so R selected species are really well adapted to unpredictable environments. And that's because they have a high number of offspring, small body size, they mature very quickly, and thus they have short generation times, right? Because they're maturing very quickly. Then the next generation can have lots of babies, right? And then when you have lots of babies, they're able to disperse widely, right? And so basically R selected species have high reproductive rates, small body size. Kind of the classic example is rabbits, right? Where think of rabbits, sort of there's always like a bunch of bunnies, they have lots of babies. Babies mature like within the next year, and then you have, more bunnies, right? So the R in R selected stands for growth rate, right? So that because they have a pretty fast growth rate. On the other side of the coin, we have K selected species, which are those that reproduce very slowly and thus have a lower rate of increase. And the K in K-selected species, you can think of that as standing for carrying capacity. And that's because these species tend to maintain their population, though their population sizes are relatively small compared to our selected species. They tend to maintain their population sizes near the ecological limiting capacity of the environment. And so we're an example of a K-selected species, though we've kind of modified our environment to be able to grow sort of relatively rapidly across the globe. But K-selected species tend to have large body size, long life expectancy, but they typically have fewer offspring, usually like 1 to 3 per pregnancy. They typically have longer pregnancies. They typically have offspring that require lots of parental care until they mature, right? So think about like how we have babies and they're like, I think, like a 4-year-old in the, like, if we're thinking about 10,000 years ago, a 4-year-old could probably live on their own, right? It's kind of like we would never let a 4-year-old live on their own right now, right? But sort of evolutionarily, like a 4-year-old can function on their own if they needed to, right? They can feed themselves and those sorts of things, right? So think about, these are the ones that, like, when these animals have babies, the babies can't like get up and walk and run away right away, right? Or like even within like the first year, right? They sort of have this dependency on their parents for a long time. And so you can kind of think of this sort of as a continuum. And so if we're going to compare our adapted species, these are the ones that have short lifespans, grow rapidly, mature, have lots of offspring. And these are typically the ones that are prey, and they're more adapted to an unstable environment because they have these really high reproductive rates. They're able to adapt very easily. Where K-adapted species, because they have longer lifespans, have late onset of maturity, have relatively few offspring that need a lot of parental care, they're more adapted to a stable environment. And these are typically also the predators within the ecosystem. So notice from our lab last week when we were doing the food web simulation, and it would run the simulation, notice that your predators, there were typically fewer of our K-adapted species of our predators than of the R-adapted plants and herbivore type species. All right, so there are some other relationships between species other than just predator-prey relationships. One of those is symbiosis, and this is when 2 or more organisms associate together in a way that benefits at least one of them. Sometimes it benefits just one, sometimes it benefits both of them. So for example, lichens are a good example of symbiosis where they seem to be plants and they can grow in a lot of environments that we would say are relatively extreme. They're usually pioneer species. They're usually the first to come back into an environment that's been disturbed. They usually are the first to colonize kind of areas that other organisms cannot. And that's because there's actually this symbiotic relationship between algae and fungi in a lichen. And so you sort of have this primary producer and decomposer relationship where they can kind of feed off each other and benefit each other. So if we're going to break down symbiotic relationships, we can say some fancy, definitions for different types of symbiotic relationships. So in commensalism, that's when one species benefits and the other species is not harmed at all, right? So one species benefiting, the other one doesn't really seem to care. Mutualism is when both species benefit. And then parasitism is when one species benefits and the other is harmed, but not usually killed. Because if you're a parasite, you don't actually want to kill your host because then you no longer are receiving those benefits, right? You have to sort of find another host if you're going to be a parasite that's actually killing the organism. So for example, we have some mutualism relationships that are obligate, which means that the organisms can't live without each other. And corals are a really good example of this obligate mutualism relationship, where corals are actually made up of the hard outer parts that we call the coral, and then inside they actually have what we call zooxanthellae, which are microscopic algae. And they actually live inside the coral, right? So they get the protection of living inside the coral structure, and then they provide food to the coral sort of in mutualism, right? And so like 90% of corals' nutrition actually comes from this symbiotic relationship. So it's really important. So if you've ever heard of coral bleaching, this happens when the zooxanthellae actually leave the coral, sort of for an unknown reason. It's kind of because conditions are no longer viable for this for the zooxanthellae to survive in that environment. And without the symbiotic relationship of the algae, then the coral is no longer getting enough nutrition to survive. Another example of mutualism are clownfish and sea anemones. So those of you who have seen Finding Nemo, right, we think about how the clownfish in Finding Nemo live inside a sea anemone. And so, right, clownfish like to live within the anemone because they don't really get stung very easily from it, and it protects them from predators who are more easily stung by the anemone. And then in return, the clownfish actually chase away predators that would try to eat the anemone, and they also help to clean it, right? Because it's their home, right? They want to have a nice place, right? So the clownfish are protected from their predators, but living within the anemone, right? They chase off things, herbivorous fish that would be eating the anemone. So an example of commensalism, right? So this relationship where one thing benefits and the other one doesn't really care would be barnacles on whales, right? So barnacles can actually burrow pretty deeply into whale skin, and they kind of stick out, right? They're happy because they're in the photosynthetic zone of the ocean when they're floating around on a whale. And so they can kind of stick out their little feeders to eat plankton, right? To eat some algae while the whale swims along. And whales don't really seem to be affected negatively. But this is kind of one of those, it could be slightly a negative relationship because if you have something burrowing into your skin, right, you might have more infection. If you have like lots of barnacles, right, it's decreasing your aerodynamics as a whale as you swim through the water. And then, right, there's all kinds of parasites that we think about. I always think of like, you know, like lice. I don't know, when we got our cat, it had fleas, right? So those types of parasites, that things that are like living on an organism's body and sort of feeding off of them. One really good example of parasitism are pine bark beetles, which actually feed on trees, and they actually kind of act as defoliators. So they don't typically kill the trees, but they prey on pine trees, right, which are evergreen trees. And so, you know, evergreen trees don't usually lose all their needles at once. But with the pine bark beetle infestations, they typically lose a lot of their pine needles, and then they kind of have a couple years of really low productivity before they kind of bounce back from damage from pine bark beetles. This is a major issue in the western part of the US right now. All right, so if we're thinking about biological production, we can use some words to talk about biological production, right? So biomass, if you ever hear that word, that's the total amount of organic matter. Organic matter is usually abbreviated OM. And so both living and non-living things are sort of included in biomass. And organic matter is produced by living things, and it's kind of this dead stuff in the environment, right? You can think of like soil has a lot of organic matter in it. Organic matter is what helps fertilize forest, fertilize our fields, right? Is we use biomass. So biomass is a result of biological production or this transfer of energy through the food web. And remember, primary production is created by producers. Secondary production is produced by consumers. And so this is kind of, this is related to the food web that we talked about last week. Right, so remember that in ecosystems, energy can be exchanged. For example, we eat plants or animals that have been consumed, that have consumed plants, sorry. And so we get our energy from the stored energy within those plants, and that is released through a series of chemical reactions in our bodies as we eat and digest that food. And we also, consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide when we breathe. So we have lots of energy exchange with the ecosystem. Think about the food web, again, that we talked about week before last. Okay, so then the last big concept of ecology that I want to cover is that concept of ecological succession. And so, again, we talked a little bit about ecological succession in lab, and I said we'll talk about it in lecture next week a little bit. And so it's important to know that environmental change is a normal occurrence, and the degree or the severity of environmental change, the rate of this change can vary. But we use this concept of succession, which is a predictable series of transitions within an ecological community over time, to talk about how this change is occurring. And primary succession is actually colonization of a new area. And so this is what we modeled in the first exercise of lab last week. And so, for example, we can start out, if we're thinking about primary succession, maybe we start out with just a rocky environment, right? And so maybe we had previous glacial activity that went through it and totally created a new landscape. Maybe we had a fire come through the landscape and create a totally new environment. And so when we have this brand new environment, right, we have this primary succession process that starts out with pioneer species that are pioneering, just like, our pioneers in the past moved into a new area that had not been colonized by white people before. And so we call this sort of first step of primary succession pioneer species. If we have a disturbance like a fire, then we would call this process secondary succession. And so as we have these pioneer species, usually they're lichens and moss, they sort of start to colonize the rock and break those rocks down. And then as those rocks break down, we start to build up soil over time. As soil starts to build up, we start to allow larger and larger plants. So first we get kind of small grasses, small herbs, shrubs, and then as those further develop the soil, then we start to get larger shrubs. We start to get trees coming in that are more tolerant of sort of wide open sunny areas. And then we finally get to the step of having a mature forest, which is when we have really tall sun tolerant species, we have shade tolerant species underneath them, we have a really complex or mature forest. And so when we finally get this diverse community of herbs and grasses and shrubs and trees, we call that a climax community, and they remain mature or at this sort of climax until we have a disturbance that resets the environment. And so disturbance is sort of a natural thing in ecology, something that I'm really interested in and have done a lot of research on in my personal scientific research. And so it's something that I think is really intriguing, right? So disturbance is really any force that disrupts the established patterns of the ecosystem. There's lots of natural processes that create disturbance, right? So a lot of those natural disasters that we talked about in class this semester can create disturbance. Fire is sort of the classic disturbance agent, but this can be infestations of invasive species. This can be hurricanes or tornadoes or any sort of thing you can think of coming through and disturbing the environment. Volcanoes, right? So I did some research on volcanic disturbance in Yellowstone when I was working on getting my PhD. And so they can be natural processes. They can be things that humans are doing, like deforestation or changing river patterns and those types of things. And so when we think specifically about fire in the Western US, there's a lot of disturbance adapted species, and lodgepole pine is a really good example of a disturbance adapted species in the Western US, where they have something called serotinous cones, which means that the seeds from their pine cones actually only get released when they get exposed to extreme heat, right? So they sort of have this wax that has to be melted by the heat from a fire to release their seeds, right? So this is kind of a major issue. If you're not having fire sort of naturally occurring in an ecosystem, then the lodgepole pine aren't going to germinate their seeds. Also, when you look at these pictures of lodgepole pine, notice that they don't have any of their lower branches, right? So this kind of helps them not catch completely on fire during a fire event, right? So hopefully the fire just stays down close to the ground. It doesn't climb up to the top of the trees. And so we can think about these natural disturbances as being cyclic with succession, where we have a disturbance event. And then after that disturbance event, we get this process of succession where we sort of develop from an immature forest to a mature forest, or maybe another environment, right? Maybe this is disturbance within a lake system that sort of resets the cycle. And so we have, right, disturbance, succession to a climax ecosystem, and then disturbance, right? And we sort of see this cyclic relationship.